This is a rich and illuminating paper. I agree with the basic claim about what is happening in Europe. I agree about why it is happening, and I agree about the consequences of it happening. Though that's the most important part of the paper. That's what we can all learn from. Now, having said that, I have three quibbles about the framing. First quibble is about the point of using Justice Scalia to make the point. The second quibble is about the point of using Kelsen to make the basic point. And the third quibble is about the point of using originalism to make this point. So let me elaborate on this a little bit. Justice Scalia, it is certainly true that he was concerned to constrain the judiciary. But in the comparison that we've just heard, in some sense, originalism in a more precise or narrow sense seems to drop out of the picture, seems to drop out of the comparison and the explanation. That is, at least for me, originalism is arguably a sufficient condition for judicial constraint, but it is not a necessary condition for judicial constraint. So I might suggest two alternative foils. One would be Justice Hugo Black, of the debates about incorporation. Justice Black, who didn't think very much about originalism, occasionally made a nodding glance to something he called original intent. But when he basically said in the incorporation debates that the 14th Amendment adopts all and only what are in the Bill of Rights, he came to that conclusion by a straightforward, what was to him simple, maybe too simple reading of the Constitution without a theory of interpretation, or at least without articulating a theory of interpretation. We might say the same thing about Justice Potter Stewart in Griswold. When Justice Stewart says that this was an uncommonly silly law, and despite the fact that being uncommonly silly, the Supreme Court had no authority to invalidate it, again, he came to that conclusion by what we might call a literal reading of the Constitution, or what we might just call a simple, straightforward, non-informed by a sophisticated theory of interpretation. Obviously, there are differences between Justice Scalia and Justices Black and Stewart, but it's not entirely clear as to whether Justice Scalia is a necessary foil or a necessary figure to support the basic claim that we've heard here about Europe's transformation to a theory or a view or a mindset of constraining justice. Kelsen said that no legal decision is completely determined by the law. He connected it with one of his most famous metaphors. The law is a frame without a picture. That is, the law provides a frame, but within that frame, the law doesn't tell judges or other legal actors what to do. The law is a hierarchy of authorizations, but it is an authorization, not itself the content or substance of which is not itself determined by the law. somewhat more dramatically and somewhat more controversially. Kelsen said that every act of application of the law is an act of lawmaking, an act of creativity. So in that sense, Kelsen, although he recognized law as a boundary to judicial constraint, it was not a boundary that came up in the occasional odd case. It was a boundary that came up in every case. And once again, I suspect that Justice Scalia would have resisted that. Indeed, I might resist it. And in that sense, perhaps a better foil than Kelsen here might be Napoleon of the Napoleonic Code, or it might be the English judges of the middle of the 19th century, as documented by Summers and Atiyah. If we are looking for a embodiment of formalism, read the law literally, and that gives you the answer. Napoleon and the English judges of the middle of the 19th century seem much better examples than Kelsen, who embraced judicial discretion, thought it inevitable, even as he recognized that the law set boundaries in it. And then to originalism. A significant part of the claim that we've just heard is that Europe is increasingly embracing a view about judicial constraint. But then we have the question, what does originalism have to do with judicial constraint? Obviously, one of the chief arguments for originalism is that it constrains judges, but it's not the only one. There is also an argument from legitimacy. So we might here think of, to use Larry Alexander's famous metaphor, the Spike Lee Constitution. So Larry talks about the Spike Lee Constitution. The Constitution says, do the right thing. And that's all there is to it. So we might imagine that the Spike Lee Constitution was written by Spike with the full approval of the population, with the full approval of officials, with the full approval of the political environment. If all of that happened, we might say that the Spike Lee Constitution was not at all constraining, but that nevertheless it was legitimate under most conceptions of what legitimacy means. So if we are talking about constraint, again, it seems to me that Napoleon or Jeremy Bentham or Hugo Black or the earlier Potter Stewart or some number of others would be the appropriate foils for the comparison, rather than conscripting modern day originalism, which seems to have less to do with the debate and the comparison that we've just heard about than it might. So I will stop with that and just urge us to think about, again, the connection between judicial constraint and originalism, and the difference between originalism as a sufficient condition for judicial constraint and originalism as a necessary condition for judicial constraint. I'll leave it with that. I want to thank the authors of the paper. I learned a lot from it. And as I said, quibbles apart, the basic comparative idea, I think, is right and important.
Thanks. First of all, this was all very useful. Let me just stress 2 points. The first point is that there is a reason why we picked Scalia and not other examples. For reasons that I think have a lot to do with his judicial style. European scholars and judges understand Scalia as a European judge, in the sense that they understand the reasoning much more than they would understand someone like Justice Stewart. And this has something to do with the what we are civil lawyers, and so of course when we read Supreme Court decisions, and when we read common law scholarship, we do these, but we also use our fundamental categories, the categories that we have learned during our education as scholars and lawyers, and we resonate much more with Scalia, and this is a general impression that European scholars have. And this is why for European, Scalia is an interesting figure. I think this has something to do with his willingness to engage with dogmatism and with general concepts. And this is something that I think it's important to understand why the interest in Scalia, where does this come from? We engage a bit with Bentham in the paper. I understand the point about why picking originalism up to a certain point, in the sense that our main argument is that Europeans are using originalism because this is a way to resurrect Kelsen. And Kelsen is a major element of our education as lawyers. It's the first author we encounter when we study law, and is the author that framed our legal systems. So this has a lot to do with the legal mind of Europeans, and what are let's say the arguments and the approaches that more likely are understood and translated from the common law culture to the civil law. Thanks.